And now, Orthodoxy with Connor Mortell in Trailer Park Chesterton.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Trailer Park Chesterton. This show is just kind of my personal project I'm doing ever since I joined my local Chesterton Society. I explained this last episode, but I'll explain it again here. We have a monthly reading of a few chapters of any given selected work of Chesterton, and we have a little meeting, discuss it, and then after our meetings, I come kind of share my thoughts here, honestly, just selfishly to have a place to record what I thought, but also hopefully so someone else listening can pick something up from it or be inspired to go read more Chesterton. I owe an apology. It's been a while since the first episode. Unfortunately, our second meeting for the Chesterton Society, when I was going to have that discussion and get my notes and whatnot for this episode, got postponed because we had planned it for the same day as Valentine's Day and Ash Wednesday. And while hypothetically everybody was on board with that, when the time came, people realized they had stuff going on, so we pushed it a month. And then unfortunately at the end of that month, I had my own personal stuff going on, so I wasn't able to get there. So you guys are just gonna get my thoughts from it without me having gotten to bounce them off anyone else. I'm looking forward to it anyway. It's still, I love Chesterton. Like I said, a lot of this is just to record my thoughts anyway. So I hope you guys enjoy it. Hopefully I'll be more consistent for this next episode coming after this, though. This all being said, last month and change, we had read the first 3 chapters of Chesterton's Orthodoxy. We read In Defense of Everything Else, The Maniac, and The Suicide of Thought. Now we're diving into his next 3, which are The Ethics of Elfland, The Flag of the World, and The Paradoxes of Christianity, which are getting a little more into the meat of it. Ethics of Elfland is arguably one of the most well-known of all of the chapters you'll find in Orthodoxy. Very often you'll hear it quoted independently just as The Ethics of Elfland. I know I listen to a couple of Chesterton podcasts and it comes up frequently. It's both it and then the chapter we're going to get to in a minute of The Paradoxes of Christianity are very Chestertonian. The paradoxes one I'll get into when we get there, but for this one, it's because it is very Chesterton uses more whimsical imagery like Elfland to describe a lot of his ideas very often. And what Elfland means is just fairy tales. So the ethics of Elfland is the ethics of fairy tales. And he begins out this chapter by explaining that as a kid, he always got told that he would grow out of his ideals. You know, one day you'll be too old to think these things. This is impractical. You'll be bored. You'll get over this. You'll grow up. And as he's grown up, what he's described himself as growing out of was not his ideals, but rather his belief in practical politicians. His strongest real political ideal that he gets into here is that he is very democratic. And he doesn't mean that quite in today's sense of the word. He doesn't mean it not in today's sense of the word, but just in more than just today's sense of the word. What he really means is simply that he believes in the common man and in common things. And for what it's worth, I'm going to dive into it here as it relates to Orthodoxy. But if you want more on it, on this same channel, Caleb and I just did an episode on what Chesterton and Belloc called distributism. Caleb and I call it localism, but it gets a lot more into the nitty gritty of Chesterton's beliefs in this. So go check that out here on this same channel if you'd like more on that. But his belief in the common man and common things, he expresses really well in his line that falling in love is more poetical than dropping into poetry. The wonderful, fantastical, magical poetry of the world is beautiful. He says, but none of it is as beautiful as just day to day. People fall in love all the time. And he shows that what the common man has to offer is much more similar to falling in love than it is to dropping into poetry. The other point he has with democracy that gets quoted very often and is one of my favorite quotes of him is that he says, tradition means giving votes to the most obscure of all classes, our ancestors. It is the democracy of the dead. Tradition refuses to submit to the small and arrogant oligarchy of those who merely happen to be walking about. And that right there is kind of one of the ways I show that he does differ from your standard understanding of the word democracy, because generally you think of that and it's just the people voting today. But he thinks that tradition and the people who have preceded us have just as much a say in that democracy of the common man as we do. But then he moves on beyond just democracy, ideals, practicalism, and he moves much more into Elfland and gets into the concept of wonder and explains why fairy tales matter so much. He explains that the world will never starve for want of wonders, only for want of wonder. He's very big on finding beauty, again, in the common man, like we just said. There's reason to find wonder just in the littlest of things. You don't need the fantastical to have that wonder. And he even shows that, and now is connecting it to fairy tales, to Elfland. And he says, fairy tales say that apples were golden, only to refresh the forgotten moment when we found that they were green. They make rivers run with wine, only to make us remember for one wild moment that they run with water. And that's exactly what I mean by he finds the beauty in the very fact that a river runs with water is beautiful in and of itself, but we need the fantastical to point us back to it. In fact, later in the chapter, he yells at the person who the engineer who wants the basic and doesn't want and isn't amazed by the little things. And he says, well, if you aren't amazed by the little things, you have the least right to talk about them of anyone. I don't have the exact quote here in my notes, but it's something along those lines. And from this, we get into the real lessons. What is it? What are the ethics of Elfland? What are the lessons we can actually learn from Elfland beyond just wonder and joy? And he explains that the fairy tale discusses what a sane man will do in a mad world. And I like that a lot. That's a lot of, you can think of really any given fairy tale or any Elfland fantasy thing. That really is what we're trying to learn. I mean, I know a lot of Catholics obviously love Lord of the Rings and Narnia, all these Christian-based stories, but what makes them valuable isn't just that they're fantasy. It is showing what a sane man will do in a mad world. We're all Boromir wanting to take the ring. That is what a sane man does in the mad world. And it uses the mad world to show us what's true. But the other thing he shows us is that it's not a completely mad world and that fairy tales have rules. The first thing we learn is that necessity still exists. The laws of reason still exist in Elfland. He quotes it here. His quote is, there are certain sequences or developments, cases of one thing following another, which are, in the true sense of the word, reasonable. They are, in the sense of the word, necessary. Such are mathematical and merely logical sequences. We in fairyland, who are the most reasonable of all creatures, admit that reason and that necessity, admit that reason and that necessity. For instance, if the ugly sisters are older than Cinderella, it is, in an iron and awful sense, necessary that Cinderella is younger than the ugly sisters. And this is a really important point. It seems silly, it seems obvious, but one, Chesterton looked around the world around him at the time, and certainly at the world around us now, and it's easy to say that at the end of the day, certain logical rules are not taken as a given. This is an important lesson to take from Elfland. The other thing that's kind of a grander lesson that at least I get from this is it reminds me of how we as Catholics understand the limits of what God does in terms of reason. God cannot create a square circle because if it is a circle, by definition, it is not square. And Elfland logic points to that. We can imagine that a tree grows razor blades. I think that's actually the example he uses. And if we imagine the tree grows razor blades, fine. That's completely, we can picture that however we want. But we have to accept certain things about the tree once we're given them. And in Elfland, that still exists. And the example he gives is the one I just read. Just because Cinderella can magically have a gown on in a wave of a magic wand and poof, she's got a pumpkin carriage, the whole world, it cannot still be true that her older sisters are younger than her. So there is still necessity within the world of Elfland, just like there is in that Catholic understanding of God's limits. Necessity also gets us then to what is not necessary. If sequence exists, the sequence has to follow, but it's not necessarily true that the sun has to rise every day. God made the sun rise every day, but God could have made the sun rise in a different fashion. We could imagine a world where the sun takes 27 hours to rise one day and 23 hours to rise the next day and does a little loop-de-loop in the middle as it goes across the sky the next day. And I'm no physicist. I can't tell you what that would do to the world, but I can tell you that that is something within God's reason. It is not rationally impossible for that to have happened differently. So he starts talking about why it is that the sun does rise the same every day. And his explanation is really beautiful. I'm a teacher for younger kids, so this really stuck out to me. So if you've spent time with younger kids, you get this. When you do something impressive, and I don't mean real impressive, I mean impressive in the eyes of a child, they will ask you to do it again and do it again and do it again. And they'll ask you to do it 45 times, and you'll be completely bored of it, but they'll still find it as beautiful as it ever was in the beginning. And he says that in his perspective, the reason the sun rises the same every day is not that we live in some boring materialistic world where the sun must rise every day because that's how it always has been, so it's how it always will be. He says the reason it does every day is that every morning God finds his creation just as beautiful, that the sun rose like that. And he looks at the sun and says, do it again, far longer than us fallible humans can find it beautiful. As we get bored with it, he continues to see the beauty in it. And I think that's incredibly beautiful. The other thing that necessity gets us is to the prevalence of limitation in fairy tale and elfland. And he points out that we as a people crave limitation. We put limitation into elfland very often where it is not necessarily reasonably and rationally necessary. It is limitation. He compares it, obviously this isn't elfland or fairy tale, but he compares it to Lot. Don't look back or your wife will turn into a pillar of salt. There is commonly themes like that in fairy tales. You can have this, but you can't do that. Every fairy tale has some rules to its magic that it puts on, and it is because we do crave those limitations. They are important to us as a people. I'm going to cut it there with the ethics of Elfland and move into the flag of the world. The flag of the world I had not heard as much about before reading it. It is one of my favorites personally. I'm not going to talk too much about it. I've already gone on a little bit from the ethics of Elfland, but it means a lot to me. I like the way he writes for this one. He describes that the flag of the world is all about taking pride in where you are, not because where you are is worth taking pride in, but because the taking pride in it is what makes it lovable and amazing. In fact, one of his most famous quotes about this, it went around a lot last fall when everybody was talking about how men think about the Roman Empire every day, was that Rome was not men did not love Rome because it was great. Rome was great because men loved her. And he goes on, he says here that to love means loving the unlovable, or it has no meaning at all. So really the theme here is in loving something for no reason. In fact, he even says the man who will improve the place is the man who loves it without reason. And that's the crux of what matters so much in this chapter, is the concept of loving something for no reason, because that's the man who will improve something. He says that the man that loves something so I'm from a little town that is the happiest seaside town in America. Now, when the poll went around voting for the happiest seaside town in America, I voted 800 times for my little city to be the happiest seaside town in America. Now, there are tons of reasons I love where I'm from. It could be because it's on the water, which is amazing, because it's in Florida and the sunshine is beautiful. It could be the people I know here. But what Chesterton points out is if you love something for a reason, when it comes time to protect that place, you will destroy that place to protect that reason. If you love something for no reason, you will improve that place because you don't care what little things happen. You want to make the place better, which again is why I voted my 800 times. My silly little story is that I didn't care. All the other towns on the list were on the water, had sunshine, were beautiful, but they weren't my town, which is why I sought to fight for my town. And that's been the same for people of all of history. They believe in what they care for, even if there's no real reason for it. And that also gets him into the concept of the optimist versus the pessimist, because he says both of them also will not do what's best for their town. The pessimist believes that it is impossible to save. The optimist believes that it is inevitable to save. Again, you need to love it for no reason. You can't be optimistic about it or pessimist about it. If you want to change the world and improve it, you have to love the world regardless. You love it for what it is and then seek to improve it for that reason. We'll get a little more into the optimist and the pessimist. Oh, I guess we won't. I don't have notes for it, but he does talk about it a little bit more in the paradox of Christianity. And before I move on to that, I'm just going to leave it with one last quote. I won't talk about it much, but it is a common theme in a lot of Chesterton's writing, so it would have been wrong to ignore it. He wrote, "The man who lives in a small community lives in a much larger world. The reason is obvious. In a large community, we can choose our companions. In a small community, our companions are chosen for us." And that does go back to his belief in the common man and localism. You get in a small community and you get what you get and you don't get upset. And again, it leads to us loving it for what it is. You love your you love your companions in a small community simply because they're your companions. You didn't choose them. They're just the people that were there, and for that reason, you love them. All right, then lastly, we've got the paradoxes of Christianity. This chapter is also very Chestertonian. Anyone who has read Chesterton knows that he always writes in a very paradoxical way. In fact, I'm even wearing my Chesterton shirt that I try and wear for all these episodes. And the shirt even says Prince of Paradox because that was his nickname. He loves paradox. But he describes paradox specifically. He has a very special definition for it that is, it's not two conflicting things. It's two things that seem conflicting and aren't. And he says that the paradoxes of Christianity were a lot of what drove him to Christianity. He said that a lot of the attacks of Christianity would attack two different sides of Christianity that seemed as if they couldn't both be true, yet both were. The first one he gets into is that the Christian is too militant. The Crusades killed too many people. The Christians are these evil, militant attackers. But yet also, Christianity is attacked for being too pacifist, too unwilling to commit sins of violence when necessary. And he looks at it and he says, well, it's confusing to say that it's both too violent and not violent enough. His next one he gets into is the sinner versus the saint. I mean, you look at, I can't remember which examples he used, but you look at St. Patrick, who is a saint I'm personally quite fond of. He's right there behind me. I think that, yeah, I'm pointing at the right one, right there behind me. St. Patrick opens his Confessio explaining he is an unworthy sinner. Augustine wrote his Confessions, and it's all about his sin. So our greatest saints are sinners, and we believe that our lowest sinners can become saints. And among that, we also include people who don't. We have the lowest of sinners and the highest of saints all within our ranks, and we're attacked on both sides. The saints get criticized for being prudish. The sinners get criticized for being hypocrites and evil. So that was another paradox. He said, how are we both of these things, both sinners and I suppose he wouldn't have said we because he was looking from the outside at the time he was exploring this. Then also he accuses us of being worldly versus otherworldly. He says, we believe that the body and blood of Christ has to be this physical thing that we actually see and consume every Sunday in a very physical manner. But we also are constantly looking to the next world, looking beyond the physical. And these are two very different mindsets to someone outside of Christianity. And then the last one is not the easy, but the obvious paradox that you see from outside of Christianity. And that is 3 versus 1, the Trinity. How can it be both 3 and 1? And all of these things make so much sense to someone already in Christianity. I mean, there are mysteries that we still struggle to understand, but point blank, all of us probably heard these things and had a list of, with the worldly versus otherworldly, we can think of the Bible telling us to be in this world, but not of it. And we can think of little answers to all of these things. But Chesterton points out that even without the answers, even without him already having the Christian background, it makes sense that the right answer would be something like this. He says, if there were a man who was described as both too thin and too thick, you could perhaps think of him as someone who is a very odd shape, where he's too thin in the wrong spots and too thick in the right spots. But you could also think of him as the man who is the right shape, and the fat man thinks that he's too thin, and the anorexic man thinks that he's too thick. And then it's, in reality, that's simply the right shape. And he even says as well that this alone can't get you to Christianity, because there are plenty of paganism calls for balance between two virtues very often. And he says that Christianity calls for conflict between them, which he finds more interesting, but that there are other things throughout the world where there's this middle ground, and that doesn't make them inherently right. But he'd been struggling with, and I may have mentioned this on the last episode, he'd been struggling with the fact that the Christian views the martyr and the suicide so differently. And then he kind of had come to understand it, saying, well, of course they're different. The martyr dies for something, and the suicide kills himself for nothing. And that contradiction was a thing he'd been working with. And when he suddenly saw these same kinds of contradictions within Christianity, it drew him a lot closer to it and brought him much more into the fold. With that, this episode's gone about as long as I wanted it to, so I'm going to start wrapping up here. Our next chapters we'll get into will be the Eternal Revolution, the Romance of Orthodoxy, and Authority and the Adventurer. Those are the last 3 chapters of Orthodoxy. So when we finish those, we'll have finished this little segment of this book, and I will let you know what we're reading next in the next episode. I'm going to say when to expect them, although, like I said, last episode, I told you to expect them just after Valentine's Day, and it is now late March, so I can't promise it'll be right on this line, but should all go well, it should be the week after April 13th or 14th. That'll be when I'm recording, and then we'll get it out as fast as we can. If you want to find anything more from me, last episode, I told you guys to follow me on Twitter and whatnot, but I gave up social media for Lent, and I don't think I'm getting it back. So the only place to follow me is this podcast right here, or if you like college sports, particularly TCU, then at TCU's 3 Wise Men, my other podcast. Give a follow right now to wherever you're watching this, on Thomist Reviews or Trailer Park Symposium, whatever Caleb's calling this site right these days. Give a follow wherever you're watching right now. And then to wrap up, same as last time, I want to pray a prayer for the intercession of GK Chesterton. I mentioned it last time. I'll mention it again. It is a private devotion. You don't have to pray. If this doesn't interest you, you can end the episode right now. If it does interest you, go to chesterton.org and you can get your own copy of the prayer card. And we're just going to wrap up right there. And thank you all for listening. Nomine Patri et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. God our Father, you filled the life of your servant, Gilbert Keith Chesterton, with a sense of wonder and joy, and gave him a faith which was the foundation of his ceaseless work, a charity towards all men, particularly his opponents, and a hope which sprang from his lifelong gratitude for the gift of human life. May his innocence and his laughter, his constancy in fighting for the Christian faith in a world losing belief, his lifelong devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary, and his love for all men, especially for the poor, bring cheerfulness to those in despair, conviction and warmth to lukewarm believers, and the knowledge of God to those without faith. We beg you to grant the favors we ask through his intercession, so that his holiness may be recognized by all, and the church may proclaim him blessed. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. In nomine Patri et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.
This concludes our broadcast of Trailer Park Chesterton with Connor Mortell.